Lisa, thank you very much for joining me today on this CareMinds podcast episode. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you for asking.
Definitely, it's my pleasure because of your tremendous work experience and acumen. And the question that I wanted to start this conversation with is the alignment between the marketing, the sales team, and the product management team. You are known within your career, you've worked with all of these units, you've helped them streamline their processes, and you were working close together with them. And it seems like the tech is catching up in terms of aligning everybody and joining the processes between different departments. It would be great to see such a thing happening in the business as well when it comes to marketing and sales and product development working together, and product development being at the intersection of those things. So my first question would be, why do you think there is still misalignment between marketing, sales, and product development?
Yep. So there's a few different reasons for misalignment. Sometimes they're simple in that the product team doesn't have any insight into the pipeline, the sales pipeline. And so sales that are in progress or contracts that have just been signed, product doesn't always know about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't always know, like, oh, wait, these are the type of customers we're after. Okay, these are the type of features that will be important. And we can't take that information in and then use it to prioritize new features going forward. But sometimes it's also the reverse, right? The sales team may not know what the product team is working on. And so they don't know what they should be emphasizing. And I mean, and the real answer to all of this is just better communication, right? And that can be, and technology can help with that, but it's not required for that, right? So in other words, sure, it would be great if let's say the sales team is using Salesforce and there were separate reports that product could look at to see, oh, what type of clients are we going after and who's close to signing, et cetera. But frankly, it could also be periodic touch-base meetings, right? So that, and this is what I usually try to do, where product shares the roadmap, and not just the roadmap in January, right? As we progress through the year, right? In fact, at various companies, I've had either weekly or bi-weekly meetings with multiple groups in the company, including sales, so that they know what we're working on currently, what we're going to be working on short term, medium term, and long term, and so that they can also give us feedback and say, well, we're hearing a lot of interest in this thing that I'm not seeing on your roadmap, and then we can have a discussion about why it should be or will not be or will be something that we can work on. So a conversation can be enough. It doesn't have to be anything super high tech. Although if there were reports or there were some place where each team could self-serve so that we don't have to have a meeting, sales can just go and say, what's on that roadmap again for March? Let me check. And they can just go check. Or I can say, we're getting towards the end we're getting into Q4. Let me see what they've got in the pipeline so that I know if there's going to be any surprises, and I can just go check. I mean, that is nice, but the key thing is communication and understanding that it's not just one department being nosy or one department trying to control the other department. It's a genuine need to understand what's going on and also what is not going on and why. Because that's the other thing, right? Look, sales likes to sell, and we like them to sell. And part of selling is saying, yes, we can, right? Like when the customer says, can you do that? Or can your product do this? Yes. They just want to say yes. And so sometimes giving them the information to say, we don't do that, and here's why, right? Or we don't do that, but here's what we do instead, which might also work. And so having those conversations in an honest way, not because we think someone's trying to trick us or give us a nonsense kind of thing, is key. That make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Absolutely. But the thing here is that sometimes it gets complicated because in certain instances, this just could be attributed to a simple human factor, such as, people worried about the review or maybe a negative outlook on their performance or expertise, and therefore they tend to kind of soften things up or not talk about certain stuff. And I wanted to ask you a follow-up question to that. What are, I guess, the most common stories that you've seen across the companies that you've helped streamline their processes and worked with go sideways? Maybe some horror stories instead of like the most common ones.
Well, I think, and I think this is true for a lot of efficiency or process-focused efforts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Process is good, right? Because a lack of process is anarchy, right? Is
Yeah.
chaos, okay? However, it's very easy to take something to an extreme and become so pedantic about the process that you reduce the ability to be creative or nimble or frankly just to deal with circumstances that the process did not know about or take into consideration, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
look, everything, our macroeconomic environment, the technological environment, everything is evolving constantly.
Right.
And so, yes, you want to have a process that is streamlined. We don't want to have to check with 5 people before you can make one move, right?
Yeah.
Because, well, that's now every time we go to move, we have to ask 5 people. But on the other hand, you don't want to check with one person, have those other 4 people who need to know about it not know, because then you get the classic one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, and that can cause problems. It can cause, depending on the nature of it, it can cause duplication of effort. It can cause, the messages to get dropped, right? Coordination to not happen. So again, any process has to walk a fine line between letting everybody know and getting bogged down in too many meetings and too many approval steps, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So along those lines, and again, one of the reasons where I've seen process really go wrong is when, again, we get that certain things need to be approved and certain steps need to be taken. However, you also have to allow for exceptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I used to talk about this a lot with one of my UX guys. There's a time for a beautiful, pixel perfect design. And then
Yep.
there's a time for a quick back of the napkin sketch,
Mm-hmm.
5 minutes. Sometimes that's enough, right? For what's needed.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you need the like I said, the beautiful thing that will take weeks to create. And you have to be able to understand that nuance. And I think that's probably the key. A lot of processes don't consider nuance, right? They like black and white. They like binary. It's a 1, it's a 0. It's a yes, it's a no. And there's a lot of depends. Maybe. Kind of.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's what a lot of processes can't handle. And then people either focus on the process and follow it, and they just stay on that path, or they say, this process is horrible. And they throw it out, and now we're back to chaos. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why whenever I put in a process, I always put it in with the caveat, hey, let's try this. Let's see how it works. Let's evolve the process as needed. That's not a fail, right? Sometimes people also think, oh, well, we put this process into place, we can't change it now. That would mean that it was wrong. No, it would mean you put a process in and you learned, and now you're improving it. So that's not a problem. That's not a bug. That's a feature, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good thing. And I think the key thing is to remain just open to it. And then the other thing also that a process can help with is at least a decision is deliberate, right? In other words, we don't want decisions to be made by accident, right? Like, oh, I guess we're doing this now. We don't know why. As opposed to, hey, I know our usual process is this, but this case seems to be a genuine exception. Let's discuss it. Does this make sense to make an exception? Yes. Okay, we're making a deliberate decision to not follow this process.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a process, right?
Yeah.
That's still a process. It's not random. But I think the key thing is not to get too bogged down.
Mm-hmm. Excellent points. Excellent points. And speaking about finding that fine line, maybe you would share from your personal experience what works best in times where you need to ensure that the processes are in place, but they're not tackling people too much. There's still room for creative decision making where it's needed. What are your general kind of like go-to questions that you ask yourself to determine where you are in that cycle?
I think part of that depends on the team and the people you have, right? Because, and it also depends on how you're managing them and how you've trained them and what they bring to the table. Because in other words, if you have a very new or inexperienced group, they may not have either confidence in, or they simply may not like genuinely have the appropriate decision-making skills, right? So they have to lean heavily on the process to know, I have this and I have this. What does the process say I should do? Okay. And that's okay. That's a good thing. And then they'll learn, right? But if you have a more experienced team, and I usually try to, and everyone says this, but I really do try to do it. I try to empower my team members so that they know that if something doesn't make sense, don't just do it, right? Like, if it doesn't make, like, we don't all have to just go over the cliff because the process seems to say go over the cliff. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, let's use some critical thinking skills here. And I think that's the key, right? Is to enable people to say, hey, this doesn't make sense. And here's why. And look, if they're wrong and someone has additional information, like, no, actually, it does make sense here. And they say, oh, okay, I didn't know that. Now I do. Now I understand. We'll follow the process. That's fine. Again, that's a good conversation. That's not a problem conversation. But the other thing is that your team has to feel confident that if they make a decision to veer away from the process for a good reason, again, not for random reasons, not because it's Tuesday and I don't feel like it, right?
Yeah, sure.
For a real reason, that you as their manager will protect them, right? Will say, nope, I understand why the team did this. Now, of course, if the team is smart, they'll also explain to you that they're going to do it and it won't be a surprise. But sometimes things have to happen in the moment. I had one PM, we talked about a phone call she was going to have with a customer. We agreed pretty much on what she was going to say, like, what direction she was going to take it in. And we knew what her goal was from the conversation. Well, guess what? The customer said other things because that's what happens. And so she decided on the meeting to go in a different direction, but she still considered it a success. And when she told me about it afterwards and she explained, look, I know we said we were going to say this, but when the customer said this, it seemed like a good opportunity to do this other thing. You know what? It made sense. I don't know that I would have done it, but it made sense. She used logic. And so I backed her. I backed her on it, and I defended her to other people who were like, that's not what we agreed to. It made sense. She did it for good reasons, and there is no harm. And I think that's the thing, right? Your team has to know that they're like I said, that they're protected, right? That you are going to defend their decisions. Again, I can't defend completely idiotic decisions.
Sure.
So you hope that they're not like, again, like that's why it depends on how you give. It's like you don't give a 3-year-old the keys to the car, right? Because he's 3 and he doesn't know how to drive. And then you give your teenager the keys to the car, but you're in the side seat. You're like, okay, you can drive, but I'm going to be right here. And then as they get more experience, you say, okay, you know what? Here's the car keys. Go, just call me when you get there, right? And you have to know who you're dealing with and what they can handle. And then you have to guide them and set them up for success. Because again, you give the 3-year-old the car keys, you're setting him up to fail, right? Like he doesn't have the skills needed to be successful with that task. So that's on you too, right? As the manager, you have to know what you're dealing with.
Are you struggling with the staffing challenges when it comes to finding the right talent in today's market? What if there was a company out there who helped you streamline your hiring process and give you access to the top relevant talent? The App Solutions Staff Augmentation is a game changer in today's workforce solutions for health tech. Staff augmentation is a process of seamlessly adding skilled professionals to your existing team through a trusted third party. Your team could be extended in under 3 weeks without you spending countless hours on sourcing, pre-screening, and interviews that ultimately lead to nowhere. Why do you want to go the old way when you can simply remove the overhead associated with sourcing, recruiting, training, and retaining talent? Say goodbye to those costly and time-consuming aspects of traditional hiring. You gain access to high-quality talent pool that has been already pre-screened for technical and domain-based knowledge. And on top of that, selected developers are completely aligned with your working hours, communication style, and processes. We get it. You have doubts and have had disappointing experience when it comes to hiring, and the App Solutions understands the importance of trust and customer satisfaction. You can try one of their skilled software engineers for 2 weeks on real tasks and pay if you're satisfied with the work. That's right, you've heard it correctly. If you're interested, hit the link in the description below, mention the CareMinds podcast, and get your sought-after team extension. Save your time and money now. Now let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, especially this last point, I couldn't agree more with you on that, because it's very important for a manager to have that first-hand experience of understanding what that road looks like and where you're going to get, and also understanding consciously that it's not just this particular way that can get you there, but it definitely should be backed up by some logic and some data when it comes to changing a process. And speaking about processes, a great chapter of your career was and still is helping companies, as you're saying, teaching them how to fish instead of like giving them the fish right then and there. And I wanted to ask you this. Oftentimes when people are in some kind of like process crisis, or in other words, they understand that certain things are not up to par, they don't work efficiently, they invite people like you to streamline this. And I wanted to impose this question on you. How do you personally approach and think about streamlining some company's process, with just not for the sake of streamlining it, but for the sake of delivering the actual value? Because sometimes companies say that they want a certain process, but what they really mean is that they want a certain outcome. So how do you personally approach that?
Yeah, that's true. It's like they ask you the question, but they kind of know what they want you to say is the answer. I hate that feeling, to be honest. But yeah, so I don't have I guess I do have a playbook. I have a playbook in that I go in and I observe, right? I sort of use the scientific method, right? I go in, I make observations, I come up with a hypothesis, etc. But the one sort of basic tenet of my philosophy is that for the most part, I assume that nobody that's already there is a complete idiot. That's my assumption. Now, by the way, sometimes I'm proven wrong, but I always give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, okay, nobody here is an idiot. Nobody here is doing things wrong on purpose. Okay? And everybody wants to get their job done, right? Those are sort of some, if I try not to make assumptions, but those are probably 3 assumptions that I start with, again, until proven wrong. And I just ask a lot of questions of a lot of people, and I listen to the answers, because I try not to ask fake questions where it's like, I'm asking you the question, but I already know the answer. I hate that. So if I'm asking a question, it's because I need to know. And, I read a book years ago called Staple Yourself to an Order. And I don't remember the whole book, but the key piece of it is they were talking about an order, like an order that comes in and then has to get processed and picked and packed and sent out to the customer. And the key thing was to really watch it go through all the different places, right? All the different hands that had to touch it. And I still take that tack, right? And then I also dig, right? So I say, well, okay, what do you do in this process? And people will tell me, it's like, why? blah, 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 blah. Okay, why? All right. And, I think someone said once that there's like a rule of 6 or something like that, whatever. I don't count. But I try to keep asking questions until I get to the real reason or need, reason that something is happening, right? Because a lot of times in processes, and this is where the inefficiencies come in, people do things, they don't even know why. Okay. So if you don't know why you're doing it, what happens if you don't do it? Does anything happen? Like good or bad, right? And the thing is that in theory, every time somebody touches something, they should be adding value. That's sort of my basic principle, right? In fact, like for instance, meetings. I don't want to go to a meeting if I'm not going to add value to the meeting. Or the meeting is not going to add value to me, right? Because then why am I doing it? I'm wasting time, right? And it's the same thing. If something comes to me as part of a process to approve or disapprove, whatever it is, am I really adding value? Or is this just like, oh, well, it has to go to her because we said it always has to go to the chief product officer and blah, 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 blah. Right? So that's sort of how I approach the process. Now, sometimes people say they want to they want to increase efficiencies because they're trying to like get rid of people or they're trying to eliminate a department or things like that. That gets trickier. What I have found in most business process re-engineering efforts is that it often it doesn't lead to needing fewer people. It just leads to using your people better, right?
Yeah.
And not having to throw extra people at something to make up for a bad process. In other words, like I had one of the first ones I did, we had one woman, and I would say 3/4 of her time every month was spent running around the building, literally, asking people questions, writing them down, tabulating them, and then putting them into a spreadsheet for those same people. What? And by the way, there were plenty of other things she should have been doing, but this task took up ridiculous amounts of her time every month. And so that was something where I was like, well, all that information is in the system. Why don't we just pull it out with the appropriate queries, produce the report? You could still run around the building getting everyone to confirm it, right? But it would take so much less time. And then you would have time for all these other things that you're not doing. And I think that was the key. It wasn't that now we don't need her. It was that now we can put her time to better use. And I think that's the key. Most people, if they're caught up with something that can be automated or can be removed because of a better process, it probably wasn't a good use of their time. And they probably, and again, now they might feel that it was very important, and maybe it was 5 years ago when the process started, but now things have evolved and now it's just something they're doing because they started doing it 5 years ago. They can sometimes be a little like, well, wait a minute. Wait, this is what I do. This is who I am. And that's what you have to deal with when you're changing a process. Like, no. You are more than just this form, right? You are an analyst. There are plenty of things you could be doing to improve this company aside from filling out this form. Right? I mean, I'm simplifying, but I think that's the key, because sometimes people get too attached to one thing and they start to identify themselves as it. Like, you are a person. You have lots of things you could do, not just this one thing. Especially if this one thing is not adding value.
Right.
Like, what are you doing? Or it could be done easier. Instead of taking 5 hours, it could take 5 minutes. How about that? Right. No. What could you do with those other 4 hours and 55 minutes that could be so much better? By the way, it could just mean leaving on time, right? Maybe it's not even other things. Maybe they're working extra hours and they're killing themselves. And now they could just be breathing a little better, right? But I try to I don't go in with a lot of preconceived notions. I assume the best. I make lots of observations. And then the other thing is, you don't just change the whole thing. You start to change pieces and you see if it works. Yeah. And And then you tweak as you go, because you generally want to keep improving it. And look, sometimes you change something, it's like, oh, cripes. No one realized that if we did this, it was going to break this. I mean, obviously, you try to figure that out ahead of time, but sometimes there's surprises, in which case, respond quickly. So, okay, you know what? No problem. Never happened. Take it out. Never happened. Put it back. Right? And that's the other thing. You could do soft launches. You can do betas of things. You could say, let's just try it with this one group before we roll it out to the whole company. You know, there's ways of hedging your bets, and not just breaking everything. And I think when you do that, it makes it easier for people to change with you, because it seems a little less sudden and a little less forced.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in that regard, you've definitely brought a great point. In that regard, it pretty much corresponds to the basic principle of the healthcare, one shall not harm. So I can totally agree with you on that. And when it comes to understanding efficiency nowadays in the environment where everybody's working either remote or semi-remote, we're not going to all be back at the office, although some companies strive to get more people in the office. I think it comes up to just the way people work generally. If everything works in remote mode, one should not change that. But that being said, how do you personally now approach understanding efficiency? How do you approach communicating about efficiency to a certain company that you're working with and setting up and streamlining processes for?
Yeah, in a way. So first of all, I always had somebody who was remote. Like, I actually thought about this in 2020 when we all went remote. I was thinking, I said, every company I have ever worked at, we had somebody in another office. We were in New York, we had a Pennsylvania office. We were in New York, we had a New Jersey warehouse. Like, there was always somebody in a speakerphone, right? So, I mean, I don't want to over romanticize the good old days when we were all together in one office. But anyway, that's a whole different story. In a way, having people remote forces a certain amount of, again, deliberateness. I probably shouldn't use this analogy because not everybody, but if you drive stick, right, if you have a manual transmission, it's much harder to not pay attention in traffic, right? Because if you're in stop and go traffic, you have to, into first gear, into neutral, into first gear, into neutral, and you have to be paying attention. Whereas if you're in an automatic transmission, you can just, you're not even paying attention. You take your foot slightly off the brake, you roll forward, right? You can cause an accident because you're not paying attention, right?
Right.
And not a huge accident, but you can, little fender bender. And I feel like when people were mostly in in-person meetings, there wasn't always somebody taking notes. A lot of times people didn't take notes, and they didn't document procedures, because if you forgot what to do, you would just walk over and say, hey, what are you supposed to do now? I'm at this point, like, what do you do? And so I feel like there was almost a certain amount of word of mouth and like dependence on, well, I'll just ask somebody. And in a way, when you're working remote and it's not as easy necessarily, I mean, mind you, you can still just Slack somebody and ask them, but maybe people don't feel as comfortable with that. But now it's almost like there's even more reason to document things and to take notes so that we remember what was said in that meeting, because maybe not everybody was in that meeting, or even meeting recordings, although I always hate meeting recordings, but it's not a bad thing, right? If you've missed a meeting, again, once upon a time, nobody was recording the meeting. You had the meeting. If you were there, you were there. If you weren't there, you missed it. Too bad, right? And guess what? Nobody took notes, so good luck. So now there's a lot more ways of actually making sure that the communication is done and remembered. Now, again, it all has to be done deliberately. So there has to be an awareness of that. But in a way, everyone's a little more aware because, again, especially when we were all remote, in a way that was good because it gave everybody that feeling of, hey, I couldn't hear everybody clearly, or, hey, I missed that, or, everyone got a chance to be that person on the speakerphone, right? And so now I think we're more aware of it. And I think in a way, because I know at my several companies now, we've used Slack a lot, whatever, Teams, it doesn't matter. But, messaging apps, right? Not just email. But there's something to be said for having a trail. Like, oh, shoot, did I send that person that file? I don't know. Oh, yeah, I did. I sent them on Tuesday. Okay, great. As opposed to giving it to them in person or telling them about it and having no record of it. So in a way, there's advantages to the fact that now we use more technology to communicate, and we can do things a little less accidentally. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that you only hear what people tell you, as opposed to, walking down the hallway and you happen to notice, oh, why are they all going in that room? What meeting is that? Like, you don't know that a meeting is happening unless you're in it. Yeah. But at least, again, there's always pros and cons. But I think when we were, being remote or even hybrid, you do have to pay a little more attention, and you do have to do things a little more deliberately. Even communication, again, you have to remember to tell people, because you can't just assume they will hear it, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a bad thing, because in theory, there's fewer assumptions being made and more deliberate communication. That makes sense.
Yeah, assumption is the last thing, especially if it's wrong, is the last thing that you want to avoid. Have in a product development environment. And you and I were talking about this on a pre-recording call, that there is a thing that some product managers do not talk about very often, and is that there is a certain misconception in certain companies that want to hire a product manager, given that it's a very new career, it's a very young career, and it assumes that you're at the intersection of so many things, but they want to get a superhuman person that is aware of all the context and has deep knowledge and expertise for 3 people of a lifespan, of an average lifespan of 100 years or something. So let's dispel some of the misconceptions, and we've already voiced an opinion that a health tech product manager specifically should come from a medical background for like solid understanding and decision making, but we are up to debate. So let's hear your opinion on the topic.
Yeah, I think, look, some familiarity with an area is always helpful. I'm not gonna lie about that, right? But on the other hand, requiring the product team to be experts in the industry, like, oh, if you haven't spent 20 years in healthcare, you can't possibly be a product manager in healthcare, that kind of thing. That is not necessarily true. And in fact, I think the counter argument to that is, if you have someone who is too much of an expert, look, everyone has a certain level of bias, right?
Yeah.
And assumptions. We all do. I mean, it's part of being human. But when you're very familiar with an industry, like super familiar, you have a lot of biases and you don't even realize it, especially if you've spent your entire career in that industry. There's just certain things, again, we talked about process and why are you doing this? Well, I do it because I've always done it. Does it add value? I don't know. I never thought about it. I just do it, right? And that kind of thing, it can be dangerous for processes, but it can also be not dangerous. Maybe dangerous is too strong a word, but it can be an issue, not just for processes, but also for product development and for really seeing your customers, because it's very easy to, again, you get comfortable, you know how things work, you know what your customer needs, and therefore you do things. But you don't always necessarily check in with your customers as often as you should. And you don't necessarily pay as much attention to what your competitors are doing as you should. Or the counter argument is that you pay too much attention to what your competitors are doing and not enough at what other people doing similar things are. Once upon a time, there was this concept of best in class, right? Or best practice. And it wasn't best in class in a specific industry. It was just best in class, right? And the idea being that you can learn from what other industries are doing and then adapt it to make sense and to add value in your particular industry. And I think that has gotten a little lost. And I remember once doing a competitive analysis and saying, our competitor's doing this, that, and the other thing. We should too. And my boss asked me, he goes, do we know if they're being successful? And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Right.
He's like, is it making them money?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I had no idea, right? I could only see that they were doing it. I mean, it looked like it made sense to do it, but I couldn't confirm whether it was actually making them money. I didn't have that information. And I thought that was a good point. And, he said, at the time, it's like, it's just the blind leading the blind, right? Like, and I think that if you're too focused on one industry, you tend to get a little myopic, right? And so now, mind you, it can also be that there's different pieces of the industry, right? I mean, even healthcare, you say healthcare. Well, that could mean a lot of different things, right? I mean, it's like, there's like, I personally just off the top of my head can think of at least 10 different areas of healthcare, right? That would be healthcare. As long as you stay open to it, you're okay. But that's why bringing somebody in who maybe has either no experience in the industry or experience in a tangential industry or industry with a similar type of client doing a similar type of thing, that can give you, not only does it, well, frankly, not only is it more interesting for the person, let's be honest, who wants to do the same thing over and over again, but it also allows for some new thinking and for some new perspective. And by the way, again, this is not because someone has to walk in and say, oh my God, everything you're doing is wrong. No. But hey, that's interesting we do it this way. Have we ever thought of doing it this way? And by the way, sometimes the answer is yes, we've thought about it. Here's why it won't work. Okay, fine, right? Okay, that's okay. But at least the thinking is there. And in a way, what it does is it gets people out of the sense of complacency. And I think that's the thing, right? Sometimes if you're too familiar, you get a little comfortable, right? You sort of sit back and I know this industry, right? And you're ripe for disruption because someone's going to come in there and make you uncomfortable at some point. The question is whether you're going to be ahead of them or whether they're just going to tip you out of that chair. And then you're going to be like, oh, what just happened, right? So number one, it keeps you fresh. It keeps you, again, critically thinking, right? And because that's the thing, right? And I think the key thing is it's not because something is broken, right? Something can change just because it's evolving, not because it's broken. You don't have to wait for something to break just to improve it, right? And I mean, there's a reason why we all change clothes every day, right? Like, it's not because we hated what we were wearing yesterday. It's just because we wore it yesterday and we want to wear something new today. And I think that, again, it's a mindset, right? And the other thing is, if somebody comes in from the outside and does have good ideas, it does not mean that you were an idiot, right? It's not what it means. And it also doesn't mean that industry experience is useless or valueless. Of course, industry experience is useful. And there's tons of it in the company. Any company in an industry has tons of industry experience.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to necessarily be in the product group. Again, a little bit is great, but having a product group that can learn from sales and can really learn from marketing and say, hey, what do you think? As opposed to coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do, go sell it. I mean, there's something to say for that, but I think the conversation is better. And I think the hybrid, we always talk about hybrid. There's something called hybrid vigor, right? Where you take two things that are dissimilar and now you have something better, right? And I think that to me is the key. And now finding the right balance, well, that's, everyone will find a different balance, but I think there's something to be said for not constantly, there's a reason why we don't like why inbreeding is a bad word, right? Because inbreeding is generally not how you get better, stronger, faster, right? You have to bring in some new blood periodically. And the product team, and by the way, I'm not saying it only product. I mean, I just can only speak to it. I'm not going to speak to sales. But bringing in some fresh eyes, some new blood periodically to mix in with the existing, not to replace it. We're not talking about a blood transfusion, but to mix it in can bring something better.
Love it. Great nuance point. And just highlights that the question is not really a binary one, and one should definitely approach it with a little bit of critical thinking and actually ask necessary questions. Yeah, and speaking about product management being a new thing, now AI is on top of that. Everybody's speaking about AI. Let's have our 2 cents on the topic. How do you see AI enhancing product development? How do you see AI enhancing product management as a career?
Yeah, yeah. I think AI will be to product management what the calculator was to mathematicians, right? Like I think it's going to be a tool, and I think it's going to be a tool in sort of two different ways, right? I'm over generalizing, but there's going to be it's helping me do my job as a product person better. Like maybe it could probably, help with like competitive analyses or a certain amount of aggregation of information, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And then there's it's going to enable me to do things with my product for my customers that I had not been able to do before, right? So it will be sort of those sort of two prongs or two branches, right? And on one side, that'll sort of be like the, I don't know, sort of run-of-the-mill consumer level AI. As it gets better, product managers will be able to use it, for, like I said, just to help in their everyday task stuff, right? Writing an executive summary of, 15 different things, right? Or analyzing all the results of A/B tests or something, like that kind of stuff could potentially be easier. Is it going to come up with a new and brilliant product strategy? Yeah, I don't think so. But, because this original thought is not its forte, right?
Yes.
Summarization, aggregation, all that kind of stuff. Yes, but of existing material. So, okay. Although I'm sure someone will try to do it and maybe they'll succeed. But I don't think that's the real purpose of it. And then, if you're a high school student and you're doing a paper on Shakespeare, sure, I'm sure AI can help you. If you're a PhD student and you're supposed to come up with something really new and clever about Shakespeare, I don't think AI will help you. Or maybe it will bring a lot of other things that have already been written together so that you can then think of something new, but it's not going to think of something new necessarily for you. But again, I'm sure there's some AI expert out there saying, oh, heck no, watch this. But anyway, that's my understanding. And then, and again, I'm happy to be proven wrong with more information. And then on the side of product features that can be enabled with AI, that is very interesting, particularly like, again, in healthcare. And in fact, I was actually just at a convention, a Node Health convention, and AI, my gosh, AI was like in almost every panel, either as the focus of the panel or because it came into the panel. And again, everyone's trying to think about it, how to evolve it, how to do it responsibly, and how to do it consistently. And again, I think those things, again, by the way, I think this is going to be figured out. There's no doubt in my mind it's going to be figured out. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And I think the key thing is, and one of the panelists used a certain analogy, and I'm going to piggyback on that. And in that, I think it's like hiring an entry-level person, right? Like I was just listening to a podcast yesterday about how one owner of a bunch of newspapers, like national, like they own like these newsletters, newspapers, they got in trouble because they put in AI for simple articles, and a lot of the articles were like nonsensical. They just, like, some of the sentences didn't make sense. Some of the phrasing was very strange. Here's the thing. They would never have assigned an article to somebody fresh out of school and printed it without looking at it.
Yeah, sure.
You just don't do that.
Yeah.
You have editors, you have copy editors, you have copywriters, you have a whole, I worked for a magazine, and every single thing that got printed, even if it was only 2 paragraphs long, got seen by at least 12 people. Okay? So this idea that you could just use AI and print it, well, come on, that doesn't make any sense. Okay? And the thing is, you also don't just hire somebody fresh out of school and say, okay, go fish. No, you teach them and you review their work and you give them guidance, and you're just like, no, that's not how I would say it. I would say it this way, right? And you teach them. And so I think there's going to have to be this acknowledgement that AI is not magic, right? And by the way, I know the people working with AI know it's not magic, but a lot of people using it at like consuming it think it's like magic. It's like, no, it's not magic. And this is not how you eliminate 50 people who are writing, right? It might help them write faster. It might help them, aggregate information faster, but somebody still has to review it. And again, to hold it up to certain standards, and every group will have its own standards, right? The New York Times has a certain standard, somebody else might have a different standard. But the other thing it's going to change the way certain people expect to interact with applications in terms of like search is the most obvious one, right? And,
right. Mm-hmm.
Being able to, instead of having to click around on a bunch of different menus, maybe you just talk to it or you just type in the question, it's going to make UI, UX, decisions a little different. I think that's going to evolve in terms of just the way, and also people's expectations for how they interact. That's going to have to be taken into account, in every product. And one of the things that was also mentioned, and then there's going to be a follow-up to it, but there was like a framework for UX. It was specifically for healthcare, but I think it will evolve to also include AI, because there's also like ethical issues potentially, and certain things, and making sure that it works equally well for all different types of consumers, right? And that's, again, and by the way, we always had to consider that, right? Menus and choices of colors, like, we always, size of fonts, those things were always, in terms of accessibility. And I think we'll just have to continue that as we work AI into product development. I think the key thing will just be knowing that it's evolving, and knowing it's not magic, and knowing that, no, this is not an excuse for laziness, because that's the thing, right? I think and not everybody, but some people think like, oh, great, now it'll do it for me and I don't have to do it. You're not completely off the hook, right? There is still work for you to do. And there is still work to be done in getting AI to where it's, and again, AI is such a broad term, but, if we talk about like ChatGPT or this stuff, and that's the other thing, right? There's more to AI than just ChatGPT, right? It's just the concept of using this technology to do different things in different ways for the consumer. The other thing that we're going to have to be careful of is not doing it just to do it, right? Like, just because you can add LED lights to something doesn't mean you should, right? Like, so it's going to be a question of like, does this add value?
Yeah.
Like, does this really help the product? Or is this something that you want to be able to put in the product description because now you think it sounds cool?
Yeah.
Like I don't know if you remember, but blockchain. And again, I'm not saying anything bad about blockchain. I don't know enough about it, but there was a classic case of this company who made iced tea, but they called themselves blockchain tea, and like their stock went through the roof.
Yeah.
Because people bought it. So we have to be careful with hype, right? Like, we don't just want to, now with AI, what does the AI do? I don't know, but it sounds cool, right? It's like, we just have to be careful that we don't over-index on it.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I definitely agree. And just seeing how AI evolves compared to, let's say, for instance, what Henry Ford did to like cars in the whole automotive industry, like no airbags, no nothing. And I think that we're at that early stage. We're still figuring out ways of using it. And I'm super excited to, there's a strong opportunity to see that growth in our lifetime, to see how people are maturing with AI and its capabilities, and really see that augmenting rather than replacing or making things for you. Lisa, thank you very much for this conversation. I really enjoyed this. It's been a blast.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for watching this CareMinds podcast episode with Lisa Schnettler, Chief Product Officer at RxSense. Hit the like button if you like this episode. Leave us a comment below and help us push this video to like-minded individuals like yourself. Please consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification. This helps our channel to produce more content like this. Until next time.